Some people say that modern speakers have gone far ahead and no vintage pair can compare with it. Others say that vintage is the only way to get high-end sound for reasonable price and that no new product even comes close to the sound quality of proper vintage speakers. Since I love the look of vintage speakers as much as the rest of us, my heart always votes for this beauty. Because when the Japanese take on something, they bring it to such a level of perfection that it becomes almost art. But of course in their own special Japanese style, where the work itself is like a ritual and every detail is measured to perfection, albeit in their own way. It seems to me that if they were to develop a new variety of potato, for example, it would certainly be the most perfect potato in the world, because it would be square, so as not to take up much space. And the whole world would marvel at it, even if only the Japanese would appreciate its flavor. The cult of Japanese technology, especially audio technology of the 80s, is essentially a unique phenomenon that still exists among many lovers of quality sound. Japan was at the height of its technological power and influence in the 80s, and this time is remembered for its many innovations in audio, iconic devices that are still hunted by fans today. For example, the legendary Technics 1200, which since 1972 is still the benchmark of DJ turntables, and it hasn't been surpassed yet. The iconic Walkman in 1979 revolutionized the way we consume music at all. It was really the iPhone of that time. Or, for example, stereo receiver pioneer SX 1980. This is a real monster of its time. It has a huge for those times amount of power, 270 watts per channel. If you meet one of these ones, buy it without thinking. It's a gem of the golden era of audio. They are always being hunted for. And these Yamaha loudspeakers are also on that list of legends. Their first version, the NS-1000M, was one of the first speakers on the market to use beryllium diaphragms in the tweeter and mid-range drivers. This gave them a huge advantage over other materials in use at that time. The NS-1000M provided exceptional clarity and detail, making them popular with audiophiles and professionals alike. All in all, it's all very cool and interesting so far, so to find out which side would have the advantage, I took two pairs of fairly well-known speakers. Modern but old-school in design Pylon Jade 20 and legendary vintage Yamaha NS-1000x. Both speakers are pretty similar in size, but they are made quite differently, as you can see. I put them in my system to deal with a very important question. Is it really possible to save money and get high-end sound by buying vintage speakers? Anyway, I've compared them face to face with modern, more expensive speakers, tried them with all the amps available to me, listened to different music, and I am ready to tell you how things really are with modern and vintage speakers. So let's start with Yamaha and set the style. These are three-way speakers with the X in their name, not to be confused with the 1000M. The X's are more advanced. This model was produced from 1984 through 1988. The cabinets of these speakers are really impressive. They are made of MDF with some dense particles. The wall thickness reaches 4.5 cm or 1.8 inches. Can you imagine? These are really some of the most dense and damped cabinets I've ever seen. They are as solid as stone. All this is covered with natural veneer, and each such speaker weighs as much as 42 kilograms or 92.5 pounds. It's a monster. And by the way, they're about 40% smaller in depth than the Jades. So I have a pretty well preserved pair, I would say perfectly preserved for their age. Yes, of course, the surfaces look a bit greasy, there are subtle hints of rust on the aluminum framing of the speakers, but nothing criminal in general. There are no chips, no signs of repair or tampering. The drivers are perfect, the cones and suspensions of the bass drivers are in perfect condition. A really well-preserved pair. And at the same time, the speakers look very cool, they really tied the room together. All those contrasting elements in the finish are eye-catching, and the beryllium domes shimmer mysteriously like chameleons. Stunning aesthetics. Against this background, Pylon Jade 20's cabinets look more modest, they don't shout about themselves so much and aren't so heavy-duty made. The wall thickness isn't known, but it is obviously less than 4.5 centimeters. And the cabinets themselves, of course, doesn't feel like a stone like Yamaha's. But Jades are new, materials and finishing are noticeably better here. This is natural American walnut covered with oil, emphasizing vintage aesthetics. And it looks of course much prettier than worn greasy Yamaha veneer. And the Jades don't have a single seam on the body. But let's keep in mind, the Yamahas are almost 40 years old and these are new. Each Jade 20 speaker weighs 35 kilograms or 77 pounds, which is not a small amount, but there is 7 kilogram difference with Yamaha speakers in each cabinet. Both speakers have grills with pins. In Yamaha's time they couldn't do otherwise, but in Pylon's case it's a tribute to vintage style. But in terms of quality, of course, Japanese grills can't compete. Absolutely cheap implementation, fabric is cheap by today's standards, and the pins themselves looks flimsy. And I'm not talking about the fact what that grills are made with the look of these speakers. Apparently that's why they survived to this day, no one ever used these ugly grills. Pylons, on the other hand, made their grills like they were for a trade show. Very cool fabric, plus a handy tail at the bottom for easy removal. And the speakers look just right in the grills too. I really like it. Now let's get to the fun part. The 40-year-old Yamaha NS-1000Xs flaunt incredibly advanced drivers even by today's standards. These are three-way fully enclosed speakers and there are, now brace yourselves, beryllium drivers. Huh? Yeah! Today, if you buy a new speaker with a beryllium tweeter, you'll pay for them as for a good German car. I bought these speakers just for $1,800 and here not only the tweeter is made of beryllium, but also the mid-range driver. At the top of the range there is a 1.2-inch dome driver, but the beryllium diaphragm itself has a diameter of 0.9 inch, it weighs only 0.03 grams, and the coil is wound with aluminum wire. It has a ferrite magnet, 3.1 inches in diameter. In the mid-range is an 3.5-inch driver with a beryllium dome that weighs 0.6 grams. Its motor has a 6-inch diameter strontium magnet and a edgewise wound flat oxygen-free copper wire voice coil. It works in its closed volume. At the bottom of the range is an impressive 12-inch bass driver with a carbon fiber cone, folks. The cone itself is a 4-layer carbon fiber matrix with a special resin for transfer stiffness, and it has radially aligned fibers. Of course, there is a heavy-duty cast aluminum basket and a huge strontium magnet. This driver is very short throw, by the way. These drivers are stitched together by a second-order crossover at frequencies 500 and 6000 Hz. In the specs you'll find frequency response from 39 to 20,000 Hz, impedance of 6 ohms and sensitivity of 19 decibels. Considering that these are speakers from the 80s, you can't help but respect everything the Japanese have done here. It's really high-end. If I had seen these speakers in person back then, I wouldn't have slept for a year. Even today, I can't calmly look at all of this. It's concentrated coolness, both technologically and aesthetically. The Pylon Jade 20 is a two-way loudspeaker with a bass reflect port on the front panel. At the top of the range, a proprietary compression tweeter is inside the offset horn. It has a polyester diaphragm, a voice coil wound inside and outside the capstan frame, which improves heat dissipation and greatly increases the speaker's acoustic power and reliability while minimizing compression forces inside its enclosed volume. A large 13-inch woofer is responsible for the middle and low range, which has a classic paper diaphragm with embossing and special impregnation, a large magnet and 19-inch diameter copper wound coil. A special feature of this driver is its high sensitivity of 92 decibels. In the specs you'll find a fairly low driver crossover point of only 1200 Hz, a frequency range extending from 32 to 20,000 Hz, an impedance of 8 ohms and a sensitivity of 91 dB. All in all, as you can see, pretty comparable to the Yamaha, except that the vintage speakers are a bit tighter with their 6 ohm impedance. What else is interesting? The Yamahas have attenuators on the front panel that you can use to adjust the output of the tweeter and midrange from the point where they can be turned off completely up to a maximum of plus 3 dB. The pylons have a front foot that tilts them back so you can listen to them right off the floor without any stands. The Yamaha doesn't have it, so I had to build it myself. Just used some books. The acoustic terminals on the Yamahas are quite large and the banana plugs go in there without any problems. But the terminals themselves of course are cheap by modern standards, and they were oxidized. Of course the seller didn't clean them, so I had to do it myself. The pylons only have 2 terminals too, but they certainly incomparable in any way to the prehistoric Japanese ones. For testing these speakers I had 2 fast tube amps. 8-watt Miraseti with 300B tubes and my Titania amp working on KT88 tubes. It has output power of 45 watts per channel. Also my solid-state Parasound JC5 monster, which produces 600 watts per channel, took part, of course. As a source I used Orinder A200 full digital player. All cables in this system are Nordost Freight 2. Well, let's get to the sound. I started with Jades and the 8-watt Miraseti. I really liked this pair. The sound is open, full and very beautiful thanks to the well-defined tube coloration. If you like everything to sound beautiful, this is it, on almost any kind of music. The Jades sound quite cozy, but at the same time not at all harsh or muddy. The compression tweeter delivers a tremendous amount of detail and does it very well. When I swapped the Jades for the Yamahas, I was very surprised. The Japanese speakers in comparison give a sound with much less response on the bass. They are downright jammed, the bass lacks the weight and punch of Trent Muller's 2019 Obverse album. At the same time, the upper mid is a bit saggy around the point where the midrange and tweeter meet. Not criminal at all, but it is noticeable. The tweeter, on the other hand, gives off a sharp, unpleasant, prickly top end. In general, Yamahas on this music are quite contradictory. On the one hand, it is noticeable that the speakers have high technical abilities. They really know how to convey a lot of details. But at the same time, they do it in many ways monetary in a bad sense of the word. The top end is quite intrusive, often prickle your ears, and at the same time the bass is somehow not very sufficient and the mid bass is too much delicate in their presentation. Here, of course, I tried to use attenuators to reduce the response of the tweeters, but they didn't help. The tweeter just got quieter, but the unpleasant sharp top end remained. Worst of all, the dip between the mids and highs got worse. The sound fell apart altogether. Adjustments do not help. Although the speakers don't color the sound, they are very neutral in this respect. But Trent Muller sounds quite unpleasant on them. It's kind of lifeless, with sluggish dynamics and rather unpleasant highs. All the noisy moments in his music sound really like unpleasant mud. And the rich, atmospheric Trent Muller synthesizers sound like they've been crushed. This music is clearly not breathing here. Okay, I realize that it's definitely not easy for an 8-watt amp to drive such speakers. So I switched to a more powerful Titania, which already delivers 45 watts per channel. And it didn't change anything. The bass is still too delicate and the highs are just as sharp. Yes, the situation has changed a bit with a powerful solid-state Parasound. It definitely doesn't let these speakers relax, but still, bass is not enough, the top end is nasty and prickly. I don't want to listen to such music on these speakers. What can be said about Jades? On electronic music they are very good. Since in their presentation blossom, they are swollen, airy, everything as it should be. And the bass is much more weighty. I have to say though that the Jades aren't as fast on the bass as the Yamahas, they sound more relaxed. Although I wouldn't call this speaker sluggish. But in comparison the Yamaha is more accurate on the bass, although it does it subtly. Neil Young recently released an album of previously unreleased tracks from 1969 and stuff from Everybody Knows This and Nowhere and After the God Rush albums. On this music the Yamahas showed themselves to be noticeably more interesting. Their fast and flat signature does its job. Voices sound with very high resolution, you can hear everything in detail. The only thing is that the lack of mid-bass makes them a little more lightweight. The same with the bass guitar, it is extremely delicately presented, and the drum kit is almost nominally sounding. You hear it clapping somewhere and that's it. On the one hand, the sound is highly detailed and technically perfect, but finally terribly cooked at the same time. On the other hand, the scene is barely visible in depths, no more than half a meter or 20 inches. But the cymbals hit you right on the brain all the time. Well, that's just the way it is. Same with Paul McCartney's fresh remaster of one-hand clapping, conventionally new Bowie and all that. Quite sonorous, light and a bit dry, you could say. Though the speakers aren't dry at all, they just know how to present everything to you somehow dry. The Jades sound warmer on this music, and the amazing thing is that you can hear more in them. Even though they don't have beryllium drivers. The Jades don't have a stifled sound like the Yamahas, plus they don't have a cramped mid-bass, so the voices are fuller and the percussion is livelier. The stage depths I can't even compare, the Jades are just in a different league. But the Yamahas do better with heavy music, because they are quite technical, fast and hold up well in intense moments, although not without faults. Here's a French band named Alceste, for example, who made quite unique music, which I would call a light and scent moans under heavy guitars. Better versed people say it's a mixture of black gaze and post-black metal. Lack of bass and unpleasant highs aside, otherwise heavy music sounds very confident. Speed, detail, energy, it's all there. Only for some reason, in intense moments, the speakers sag in some waves. At first they will transmit all this meat and noise perfectly, but then they will drop in resolution for a couple of seconds, then again perform normally, and then once again a failure. And such things are constantly encountered with these speakers. My ears get tired after 20 minutes. Jades on such heavy music can't boast such precision and speed, but in general I can't say that heavy music is not for them. They just serve it differently. There's more punch, the guitars are fatter, the top is very cool, and the detail is very high and it doesn't prick your ears at all. Yes, in the most intense moments they sometimes lose speed, but their impeccable timbral balance and dynamics help in such situations. What's the bottom line? In the end, no one is perfect, but what I personally took from this experience. The old Yamaha high-end speakers can still do something, but with a lot of caveats. They were made with the most advanced technology of the time, and in theory, beryllium drivers should be a head above all polymers, cloth and metals. But the truth is that these old high-end drivers are no better than ordinary modern speakers by today's standards. Some just good average modern titanium tweeter gives the same level of resolution and speed. Jade's compression driver gives at least the same resolution, but does it at a much higher quality, it doesn't kill your ears. And of course, Yamaha's old beryllium drivers can't even be compared to some modern beryllium ones. Plus, Yamahas in general left an impression of capricious speakers. At some point they play more or less okay, but at some point just unacceptable. For the whole time, which is more than a month, I couldn't feel them as stable sounding speakers, they are always floating in sound. The Pylons, on the other hand, act as a completely understandable and predictable sounding speaker. Their character is stable and pleasant on any music. Yes, they aren't as neutral in presentation as the Yamaha. The Jades serve everything a bit more pleasantly and beautifully as it really is. But, thank goodness, not enough for them to be any particularly genre specific. These speakers also play absolutely any kind of music. Of course, many people will argue that I'm comparing speakers from different price ranges. 1800 for Yamahas is not 3000 for new Pylons, but let's be realistic. If these Pylons were used, they would cost less. And the main thing, as I said in the beginning, I wanted to answer the question: is it possible to save money and get a sound like from more expensive speakers? As my experience showed, you can't. If you save money and buy such vintage, you will not get the high-end sound of more expensive speakers. There are no miracles, unfortunately. These Yamahas will give you a user and listening experience on par with their cost at best, but no more. Add to this the variables in the form of residual life of the various components on site, and everything becomes even more doubtful. The main thing is that these speakers give is a pleasant feeling of owning a piece of history, one of the most interesting museum pieces of golden era of audio. but not speakers with sound that is ahead of modern models even at $500 more expensive. If you want vintage aesthetics and really good sound for years to come, you should be looking at speakers like the Pylon Jade. They won't be a museum piece for many, many years to come.